So my opening question for you is, what stands out to both of you as the biggest challenge in today's developer workflow in terms of productivity that needs to be solved? And I'll leave you to it.
I feel like we might both be a little biased from different angles.
Not using Vercel and Sentry for every single project on Earth.
That is, I think that is critical. I guess I can start. So what stands out for developer productivity? I think my only goal is to like ship the thing and move on. And I'm always like looking for like the kind of the easiest way to do that. And half of this is probably my job. I don't get to do anything interesting anymore. So all my code is like a little hobby project, and I don't want to spend 3 days figuring out Webpack and stuff. I don't want to spend 3 days figuring out how to deploy this to AWS Lambda or whatever it is, right? And so I think it's just that. Like, just give me a template project or a framework that's like low friction. Give me a way to ship it to production. And the Sentry will tell me if I screwed up somewhere, if I have any customers whatsoever in my side projects. But I don't know, that's like critical for me, just time to production.
Yeah, something that we spend a lot of time thinking about these days is how to balance that ease with managing risk. So if you only make it easy and optimize that variable, then you'll just set everything on fire. Like you'll bring down the website or make a change that seems intuitively okay to you, and it's a bad change objectively for the performance of the site, performance of the business, or performance of the actual like rendering layer or whatever. So I think the motto that we've been using is, can we help developers transition away from thinking of themselves as just like pure builders to scientists, where any change is conceived as a hypothesis of some future improvement or result that you want to drive, and that should permeate through conversation. Like, I'm thinking of my change not as something that it will absolutely be merged into the main branch and shipped to everybody at once, but that idea of the progressive delivery and being okay with failure and shutting down the initiative and rolling it back as well. And I think we don't work that way as a whole. I think developers, we tend to be overconfident. We're like, get push. It's going to be a great change. So I think it's important to go through the technological changes as well as the behavioral and cultural changes that come with that scientific, curious, hypothesis-driven mindset.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because like James was up here talking about what I would describe as iteration. And I think if you work at a startup, the thing you probably value is like there's not a lot of process. You can get things done. And I think it's very easy to get lost along the way of like the goal has to be very far away or it's a big thing. And I think if it's hard to ship code or it's unsafe to ship code, you're less likely to take like small steps. And so I think it's like the unwritten thing. Like you're not going to go to a company and be like, hey, what if I told you could ship small pieces of code more frequently? You'll be successful. Like I don't think you can make that pitch, but there is like a strong correlation to like the teams that ship frequently are usually the companies that succeed the most, right? And I think that's the dilemma, especially both of us, our companies have kind of grown in terms of humans at a similar clip, and it's like the more people, the more problems, I guess, more challenges at the very least, so.
Yeah, if you relate it to the early days of a startup, what grants a startup the really fast iteration velocity is fundamentally not having users and not having data. So if I want to add a column or like dramatically change my schema or change an underlying vendor or whatever, it just all happens because I have no users. So I think the challenge is, can you ship at a large organization with billions of users, but still act as if there are no users? And I think the methodology here seems obvious when you analyze it like this, which is like, well, ship it to just yourself. Ship it then to your team. Ship it to the organization. Ship it to your first customer that you're doing user research with. I just think that we're not yet connecting the dots all across the stack and tools to make this a default way that people work, period. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and we're certainly working hard on this, as well as Sentry, but it's exciting that we're very close and we're also very far away. I think a lot of that comes from that binary thinking of it's either shipped or not shipped at all. Like it's either in a local branch or some branch in Git, and or it's all in on prod, and there's no gradient to it.
Yeah, and so everybody should know what Vercel is. Hopefully, I would say it makes deploying what is a common app paradigm very simple these days. I almost feel there's a lot of technology change, and so I wouldn't say it's a solved problem, but the sort of approach to it is kind of a known quantity, right? And I think it's constantly getting harder. But here's my question for you: is like, I have opinions on this, of course, but what do you think is like, what are the gaps today? What stops us from actually being able to de-risk and move fast? Because I think we're almost good in some parts, but from a goal, it feels like we're not even remotely close to that.
Yeah. I think one obstacle is that doing it right and doing it quick and dirty are very different things. So I think on some level, we're all doing the experimentation thing. We're all moving fast on some level, in some domain. But that doesn't always mean that we're doing it in the best possible way. So our company, with our investment into our framework, Next.js and Vercel, what it's trying to say is like, hey, well, we're going to templatize doing it the right way. At least the way that we understand it as the inventors of the web and the inventors of the cloud, like Amazon.com and Google, how are they shipping software? And what is the gap between that and how you are shipping software? And by you, I mean literally like the Fortune 5000, all the companies that are rushing to become tech-native companies. So can we bridge that gap through what we like to say is like the transition from DevOps to developer experience? Because the best way to sell these things is not by reading a book of like the 200 commandments of Google SRE, which is relatable to the previous conversation, but by giving you an engine and a system that automates all of that. And if we can make it so pleasant to use, and by this I mean keeping the developer in a state of flow, giving them real-time feedback in less than 10 milliseconds when they change something on their code base to seeing their real-time preview on their screen. Those are the things or approaches that we think are going to be conducive to democratizing all those good practices.
Yeah, I think I would always, you start a company, you got to like make up some kind of dream at some point, right? There's like the reality of what you're doing, and there's like that, but hypothetically, and I had this idea in my head for a long period of time. I'm like, wouldn't it be great if we could all adopt Facebook's approach to deploys? Now, they're kind of slow in a way. If you think 0 to 1, like it's either not in production or it's fully in production.
Totally.
But, and I've never worked there, this is all hearsay, so bear with me. But my understanding is, at least for a long period of time, Facebook would deploy internally first. So all employees, they were the beta testers. Employees can complain, that's okay, they get paid, right? It's safe, it's no customers, you're not gonna lose any revenue or anything. And I'm like, that's great. Yeah, and then you just scale it up from there. Pick whatever flavor of expanding. And I'm like, that's what I want. Because once you have that, like you de-risk immensely, things like Sentry become more valuable because you can do it earlier in the life cycle. And I feel like things like Vercel and Sentry can enable that, but I feel like there's still gaps in like, for me, it's always been the database of like, state is hard, right? State is state. And you don't want to change the state, but a lot of the critical things, at least for technology companies especially, are state change. And that's always been the gap for me for like kind of realizing that dream, I guess.
Yeah, one hypothesis that I have is that a lot of what we work to do, one of the dreams is getting everyone on the same page in a large organization. And this can be as simple as actually and tactically getting everybody on the same web page. So I think everyone got the news of like, oh, Figma got acquired by Adobe for this amount of money and whatever. And like, I think what they did well is that they got designers and everybody else at the company on the same page about what was being designed. I think what's been more challenging and we're working towards fixing is, can we do that for what's actually being deployed and built? Like, can we actually get everyone to see the same exact thing? So I think the Facebook example is so relevant because the first thing you want to do is like, if we're all working on a project here, we all need to get on the same page really fast about where the product is at, what are the gaps in UX, is billing wired up correctly, are all the notifications working, and we have to experience that. And that's a big jump from how we're used to building software because it started out with FTP and like YOLOing it into prod, which kind of gets you some of those benefits. Then it went to source control, and I think we all became kind of over-obsessed with the source itself. It's all about diffs and PRs and highlights and comments on the code, and then people started trolling with like, oh, you should have used a tab instead of a space here, and then we invented prettier, and we fixed that. But we're still like very zeroed in or like zoomed in into the code, and I think we have to take our eyes more into the experience. I think where Sentry probably got a lot of traction for was that a lot of people were looking at the code and saying, oh, it looks good, and then you ship it, and then React shits the bed, for lack of a better word, on the client because you're not using Next.js and server rendering, and then your page is literally empty with a sad face in the middle of the page. So I think the more we can put people in front of that same page as quick as possible, then it benefits not just the developer, but everyone else at the organization. And that's, I think that's a dream worth pursuing.
Yeah, I agree, because it's like, I've never been a fan of staging in like the traditional sense of staging. It's often
It's
like,
fake news.
Yeah, it's like QA teams and stuff,
Yeah.
and it causes just as many problems as it creates, frankly. And now, I don't think we're there, but at least if you use something like Vercel, you can kind of do staging, right? Maybe not your entire infrastructure or all of that, but you at least get a portion of it. And so like the people, maybe we're lazy. I don't know what it is that causes us to take all these risks in production, but like it removes some of the excuses of, oh, I'm just going to ship it, and then it probably is going to work because, I don't know, it worked in this weird scenario. Well, it's like mostly live, right? Mostly works, probably good. Like,
yeah, it has to be in prod. I think it has to be in the real environment with the real data, with the real users. And I think, again, if you're the first user and you can experience that. The other thing that I think is really interesting when you talk about the dream, one of the things I always visualize, and I put this into DALL-E recently, and I got a really cool image for it, is like Minority Report minus Tom Cruise. No, just kidding, no offense to him. But you have like this gradient and like this explosion of possibility in front of you, much of which can be auto-generated and auto-permutated. And then you're acting as this like creative individual who's choosing the right thing to work on, prioritize, ship, and is getting real-time insights about how those things are evolving. And obviously, like, you go from that to what we have today, and there's a big gap. But I think with all this technology, especially with all these advancements in AI, and this blazing fast deployment methodologies, we're approaching that point where we're choosing between permutations of ideas. With Vercel, we're starting to see this a lot with folks that are using our dynamic edge rendering to basically give you different possibilities or A/B tests of a tagline, of a contact sales button, of prioritization of the pricing page. What should I highlight the most? What logos should I prioritize for different people? Should I bring the user identity into every page instead of making this static pages that don't really have your identity and your preferences in it? And I think that starts to get really interesting because once you assume that the default is dynamic, you start being empowered to present multiple different options to multiple different stakeholders. And again, this is something that we as a collective industry, we're not quite there yet. There's been some hacks, there's been client-side JS snippets that kind of get you there, but it's not really how we build software. And if we can get there, I think our jobs become a lot easier, and I think we deliver the right thing more frequently.
here's a question on that front. I'm a big hater of data. I hate A/B testing with a passion. Ask anybody at Sentry, I'm the bane of their existence. And I hate it because often the outcomes don't match the inputs in terms of effort, right? And even going back to James' talk, with that idea, ignoring the dynamic aspect necessarily, but just the idea of data, and this is a slight departure, how do you think about, how do you not be paralyzed by just getting something that's good enough and moving forward?
I think effort really needs to plummet to zero. I think this is the big obstacle, is that as developers, and this is why we insist on the transition from DevOps to Dev Experience, as developers, we have this overhang of all the things that could go wrong. We're kind of obsessed with okay, a lot of my customers today are thinking about Black Friday already. And I'm like, wow, I didn't even think about Black Friday until you just pointed it out. It's so far in the future and our systems are so generically capable that it's not on my mind. But I could see how if you come from the traditional cloud is really hard, scale is really hard, everything needs 10 layers of manual caching that you maintain. I could see how that starts removing some of that creative potential. You start being less ambitious with your code and more defensive. So frankly, A/B testing is a great stress test of how much can you permutate dynamically, how much are you free to dynamicize, and really it's easy as saying if else, right? It should be that easy. If some condition, component A, else component B. Now, it sounds super basic. It's like programming 101 is the first thing you learn. However, to do that at scale and to actually program in this manner is not happening today. We're still kind of with this overhang of like, oh, there's all these things that could go wrong, or I need to decide what kind of framework I use, what build tool I use, and how am I going to revert it? How am I going to get exceptions that tell me what was the branch that actually run and get the stack traces to be accurate? So I think as we continue to integrate all these tools better, we free the developer, and with lowering that barrier to entry to do these ambitious things, I think it's a huge leap in how people build.
Yeah, I'd agree, because like the more friction there is, the more time consuming it is, the less frequently you're going to do something about it, right? Like Sentry's, we have the same problems as every other big organization most of the time, which is things get slower. It's not always people, sometimes it's technology. We've got a monolith still. It'll take us upwards of an hour to get a release out the door. If it takes an hour, well, you're like, okay, it's a little complicated. I got to think a little bit more. And an hour is not that much time relative to a lot of companies, right? But it is actually a lot of time in our world. Yeah. And if it takes an hour, I'm like, okay, I can't mess this up, because it will take an hour to go back the other direction, right?
Yeah.
And that's already bad. It takes 10 seconds. Or you can kind of run a copy very quickly as well.
Yeah.
Okay, you're willing to take more risks. Even if those risks don't have like harmful consequences, you're at least willing to be a little bit more, I guess, dynamic in thinking and how you approach a problem.
We're about to roll a feature that I'm really excited about. We dub it instant rollback. And obviously there's been versions of rolling back software done a lot throughout the years. But this one guarantees 0 downtime rollbacks in 300 milliseconds globally. And ensures that your front end doesn't break while certain nodes have some copy of the app, and like all those things that you would otherwise worry about as a DevOps engineer, like magically disappear. And one of the things that I'm excited about is, well, 2 things. One is, what happens now that people have this capability? Obviously, I'm not wanting for people to break software more frequently, but it is freeing and empowering to know that if your calculations didn't pan out or your internal test didn't pan out, like you can have that confidence of like, my risk window is 300 milliseconds. And the next thing is integrations, right? If Sentry can tell Vercel that the error rate on a certain critical page is going up, now Sentry and Vercel can autonomously cooperate to fix the problem within 300 milliseconds. So this is an example of like what technology can do. And I think it's sometimes fascinating to ponder, why is it so slow in other versions of the world? Is there something that inherently makes it such that it can't be 300 milliseconds? And 300 milliseconds turns out to be a factor of 2 within the theoretical speed of light limit between our 2 furthest locations, which are like Singapore, I think, and like US West 2 or whatever. So I think trying to always challenge ourselves to do better from those first principles unlocks a lot of this. Well, like, there's no reason that an A/B test should be hard, auto-tuning should be hard, coming up with flags for everything should be hard, experiments for everything should be hard, and making all of that performant as well. So I think we need to also collectively demand a lot more of our tools.
Yeah, I agree. There was some feedback I gave the Kubernetes team back in the day, right when it was really catching on. I'm like, I'm sure it's great. And this is my feedback to them. I don't really care about ops. I know a lot of the stuff, but it's not interesting to me. And I'm like, look, you guys have built something very useful, I'm sure. It doesn't make my job easier to get the code into production. It makes SRE's job easier to manage a fleet of servers. Right. And I'm like, there's still this massive gap, right? And everybody kind of keeps ignoring that layer. And the thing that's been interesting to me throughout my career is like, you often solve the problems that you see or that frustrate you. And mine has always been like, I just want to like ship the code. I want to tolerate the risk a little bit. I want to know when I mess something up, most importantly, and why it's messed up. But it's always been one of those captivating things. And I'm like, oh, we're just so close. But I think the challenge you talked about, like organizational scale, well, it's more like tech scene scale. Yeah. It's like everything has to work together, which is very difficult.
Yeah. The other one that I think about along those lines is the cloud really needs to work for us. We don't work for the cloud. So a good example would be, I was on Hacker News today, like there was an outage in US West 2. And like it literally should not be impacting a single human being on this planet. Someone was complaining that their Roomba stopped working. But that's an example of you're working for the cloud. You negotiated with the cloud that all you could do with the budget that you had was to maintain 1 cluster in US West 2. But the premise of the cloud was, going back to like, what was the dream of all this? It was, well, like, the cloud is everywhere, it's disposable, it's just water vapor, it gets recreated, it's cheap, it's scalable, and all these things. So that situation should literally not happen. And if it's happening, there's still work to do to make the cloud work for us. And I think it goes back to like, if that's not the case, then it's certainly inhibiting your ability to put out great products and be productive. Because you're going to be thinking, oh, I have to prevent that next outage in US West 2 of API Gateway. I think the more you find yourself thinking that way, I think the more you need to run in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I actually agree. Like, I think we can all agree, it would be nice if we bought cloud services and then we didn't also have to think about how we make those cloud services redundant, right?
Yeah.
Like, that is the sell, that is the dream. And I'm like, I think part of it is like, you can build products in different flavors. Same tech at the end of the day, right? Like, why is it that we have to think about the region choice whatsoever? I think it's a fair question we should all ask ourselves. Like, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to invest a ton of Sentry engineering dollars, which are invested by every single company in the world, into multi-region support. But I have to. I have no choice. And so we just sit here solving the same problems over and over and over. And that's a lot of money and a lot of people hours, right? And that limits our progression of other things, right? And so I'd agree. It's like one of those things I'm like, And it's one of the reasons like Sentry, generally speaking, avoided magical cloud services, because they're like, yeah, I don't know what happens there. But it's a dilemma for sure.
The best magical cloud service is DNS. So when you point your DNS to us, like we'll figure out how we route to a working thing. I think it's true for Sentry. Like it is truly a magical technology that is globally distributed, redundant, self-healing, super fast, low latency. Awesome.
Yeah. Let's see, we got 8-ish minutes, I think. That's how timers work. Switch gears to something completely unrelated. I did a bunch of nostalgia this morning. We got a few references from everybody that's been around the block a few times. It's been a lot of like people who have been in the business for a while talking about horror stories today. So I want to switch gears to that. Earliest memories in your career, pre-career even, of tech. What was like a highlight of early days for you that got you hooked?
Honestly, it's super weird, maybe too nerdy. Although for this crowd, we're all in good company. It was installing Linux and getting it to run the X server, X11, which nowadays is being replaced. I was reading the other day, I'm like so out of touch. I'm not using the new X server. And then launching a terminal and being able to compile a C program that said hello world. And I think it all, like, this is probably what inspired my developer tools career, because I had tried to use Windows to do the same thing. Just go from like idea to hello world. And Linux, interestingly, shipped with either, like Red Hat at the time was like, depending on how you selected different options in the GUI installer, it would come with a lot of pre-installed tools. Very much like Mac OS has a good set of defaults, like SED and AWK and Unixy tools. And with Windows, it had literally been weeks and weeks and weeks that I had just entirely given up. Imagine giving up so hard that you've given up on an entire operating system and you have to tell your parents that you're changing it into something that they've never heard of that will allow you to develop in it. And I think there's still a lot that can be traced to that experience that we still see today. I always challenge our team to think not just about a net new sign-up that wants to deploy their first site, which we have a metric for, and it's super fast. I'm really proud of it. But also, I'm joining a company that uses Vercel as their developer platform. I've never even heard of the tool. I've just been onboarded into the company. I've been given Slack access. I'm like, hello, welcome. I'm Mary from New Zealand, and she wants to make a change to the code base. And what are the series of steps that you need to take today to make that hello world happen? Even change a color on a website or a single line of backend code. And it's a lot. And I think we're constantly working through the pain of figuring out what the right tech incantations are to not have to maintain and upgrade the systems. But it goes back to like, how quickly can you go to that aha moment? And it's not just when you're learning. Because I think we're constantly learning. Every time we join an organization, we start a new project, is that new learning moment when you want to use the greatest and best tools possible.
Yeah, actually, vivid memories of joining companies, and one of the first projects was always like, go add yourself to like the about page or something. And it was almost like this implicit onboarding experience, and you were always so proud how easy it was, and then it becomes not easy, you know. Okay, on the other side, least favorite moment of early days tech. What was the most frustrating?
How early days?
As far back as you want to go.
I got hacked one day. So someone on IRC, like there's the famous, so the other day I saw the funniest joke on the internet, on Reddit programming. Someone said, run rm-fr, not rf, you can permutate the order, / to remove the default French language pack from your operating system. It takes up several gigabytes, you'll free a lot of space, just do it. Which is really mean, because I worry that someone will do it.
Don't do that.
Yeah, it's not the French language pack, is force recursive / you're gonna delete everything. I think someone probably did that to me, but I think that's not the one that hurts as much. It's like someone gave me an SSH incantation in IRC that set up a reverse tunnel to my computer. Very clever, and this was like way back in the day. His name was Netroot. Netroot, if you're out there, you got me. And then my entire computer got pwned, but I learned a lot that day.
Yeah.
Like, don't execute random commands from strangers. It's like candy from strangers, but especially if they start with SSH, or they require sudo in front. So those are the things, because like I really started out like wanting to be a hacker really bad, like reverse engineering, coding competitions and all that, and then I got pwned in the most like easy way that you could imagine.
I gotta assume that the RMRF has hit so many people. I think it got me once.
It's
better
RMFR,
than
French language.
Yeah. So bad. I do remember those days. Like MIRC was a big one for me, and all the script kiddies. I was one of them a period of time. We're all over there. I
Yep.
remember writing scripts that, you know, I'm like 15 years old. Bear with me. Somebody I didn't like would join a channel, and it would exploit like a Smurf attack or something on their network, and everything was so bad back in the day. You could send a packet to a bunch of common modems. It might have been AOL, actually, and they're just disconnected instantly from, like, there's nothing they could do against it, right?
Yeah.
And it was just that dead simple, right? It was
Yeah.
bad. Nobody knew anything, you know?
Yeah, I'm so jaded now that I'm always kind of like engineering adversarially. Like, what's the max size of that payload? What is the encoding? Like, what is the right? How early are we failing in the pipeline? Like, because these are the things that teach us. Yeah.
It's just like James was talking about, like known knowns and unknown unknowns, right? And it's kind of I've like security's been a passion project over the years, and I find it interesting because it's like ever evolving, and it's actually kind of hard to predict. And so it's always interesting if you're just like, if you think of it as like science, like the constant changes, and like, oh wow, I didn't even think about that. Okay, how could I counteract that? And it's just a fascinating domain, I guess.
Yeah, which kind of brings it back to where we started, which is that move fast and have an awareness and a management and a tolerance for risk. I think that's a like really key takeaway here. It's like too easy and complete disregard for risk, like race to the bottom. Too hard and too risk averse, race to the bottom. So what is it like just right, and how is the technology that you've used, purchased, et cetera, enabling you to be in control of that?
All right, I think one more topic. What is like, I want to focus in on JavaScript a little bit, just because it's such a pain point for me throughout the last 10 years. What is like, what is the future of JavaScript that you see, and or like, what would you change it into if you could? If ignoring like the actual challenge of doing it, what would you make it be? Or what do you think it's going to become?
Yeah, to me, JS is always a moving target. I've always likened it to a biological system more than a software system, because what is JS today? Well, is it JS, or is it TypeScript, or is it TypeScript with JSX, or is it TypeScript with language extensions that make you more productive, or is it Svelte? Is it Svelte's syntax that augments and uses JavaScript in clever ways, like the label indicators that have a reactive meaning within the context of their compiler? So I think what's interesting to me is to separate language from ecosystem and community. I think the thing that I was nerding out with Jordan a lot yesterday about NPM, and it's easy to poke holes on NPM, but NPM is this perfect reflection of that organism of we're all convening there to share code at a massive scale. And with that comes all of society's problems. We're talking about rogue developers. We're talking about nation-state attacks on, shipping post-install malware vectors to people that pass away, and like who maintains their packages if they have hundreds of millions of downloads every week. So JS to me is becoming synonymous in many ways with the cloud. This is becoming obvious with the edge, right? There were two competing hypotheses for the edge: WASM first or V8 isolates first. And it almost seems like every time the JavaScript gets tested, it passes the test. Okay, now we're all running JavaScript at the edge, and that's how we're enabling a more dynamic world. And WASM still has a role, but interestingly enough, it's still within the context of aiding or coexisting alongside JS and augmenting it where it falls short. So I think, the future of JS is just quite unpredictable, but also constantly getting tested by the community and industry to be improving. And we have this massive investments in the ecosystem that you can piggyback on to solve virtually any problem that you have with basically learning one language.
Yeah, I think that's been like the golden idea, right? Reusability. I know we're at time. I don't know, like, you want to plug the next comp coming up? I don't know, we'll give you the plug.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Next.js solves all of the problems that I just talked about out of the box with no stress and no French language pack operating system removals. So check out nextjs.org/conf, October 25th. We have really amazing announcements, all of which are aligned with a lot of these intentions and dreams that we just talked about. So very excited about that, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.